Good morning and welcome to Practical Christian Lessons. I'm Joshua Pearsall, and today we are going to be going over a brief history of the Canon. For anyone who has never heard the term canon when it comes to the Bible, I should have table of contents. When we're talking about a canon, it is what is canonical. And it's not just a term for Christians. This is in tons of literature. Star Wars fans are probably very familiar with the term. Things like that is what stories are considered part of the official documents or books or etc. of given thing. In our case, what are the books of the Bible? Right, a lot of them. Right, here's your table of contents here. This is just the classic 66 books most people are familiar with today. I don't have any of my Bibles with the Apocrypha on my desk, so I'm not going to bother reaching for those right now. And then you'll see in other non-Protestant Bibles in the modern day, some might have what you'll hear is the Apocrypha or Deuterocanon. If you don't know what that is, we actually have a playlist on our channel where we read through that, we go through that, and point out its value and why we should still be reading it today, even if we don't accept it as Scripture. I recommend checking that out. And I'm just feeling called to talk about this today. That's the only reason we're doing it. I don't have any set books to recommend today. I don't have any set, really anything. We're just kind of going to be winging it here today. But the reason I do want to talk about this is because in my recent video on Sola Scriptura, one of the common comments in there that was critiquing us as Protestants is, how can you have the Bible without the church? I can't tell you how often I hear that objection, just in general. But it's one of those things that really is a problematic way of thinking. And if you were in the early church and said that, you would be the one in the minority. They would not side with you on that stance. And what we're just going to be talking about today, we're not going to be digging into that too much, a little bit for sure, but we're just going to talk about some of the various canons that have popped up throughout church history and why that argument really isn't something we as Protestants should be concerned with. And I'm saying that because I know a lot of people who, when pushed on that, they get really anxious and are like, oh, how can I know that the books in my Bible are actually the books of Scripture? And it just kind of causes people to have some worries that I don't think they should be having. And for me, one of the easiest examples to go to is actually via Scripture itself. Right? You'll hear Scripture doesn't give you a canon list. No, it doesn't. But when we look at the prophets, right, Isaiah and such, one of the things you'll hear is that the books are in the Bible only because the church accepts them. That is the only reason they are binding. And to which case I would say, would you say that to Isaiah in Israel or the other prophets? Because Israel didn't accept a lot of the prophets at the time. In fact, they killed them, they martyred them, they persecuted them. But yet, their words were still binding. They were still Scripture. They were still the words of God, spoken through the prophets to the people, and they were expected to listen, and didn't. And it's very much the same way, Old and New Testament, throughout the entire Bible. It's not the church's job to declare what the canon is. It is the church's job to recognize what the Scriptures are. That's our role in the canon. Does the witness of the church have an important role in how we determine what those books are? Yes. Does tradition have a role to play in that? Absolutely. If you hold to Sola Scriptura, that shouldn't be a problem for you. I don't think there should be a problem, even as Protestants, with saying we accept the canon of Scripture we have because it's the tradition that's been passed down to us. That shouldn't be an issue. It really shouldn't. And the biggest reason that shouldn't be an issue, and you'll hear, especially from Roman Catholics, specifically Roman Catholics, they'll talk about the Council of Hippo or the Council of Carthage declared the canon, and then it was settled from there. The issue with that is that the Council of Trent is the first council in church history to declare a universally binding canon. In their eyes, universally binding. It's only binding on Roman Catholics. And that's important to note. It's only binding for Roman Catholics. And that was after the Reformation had already begun and been well underway. Luther, no matter how many claims you hear about him removing books from the Bible which aren't true, and tearing epistles out, which isn't true, two other figures, and notable figures, not small figures, notable figures in his day, had a similar view to the canon as Luther and questioned the validity of some books. Most notably is Cardinal, I'm going to get this wrong, Cajetan, who questioned Hebrew, James, 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude. And these were questioned in the early church as well. We'll get into this when we go into the history. And then Erasmus, one of the famous opponents of Luther, who actually gave us the best known Greek New Testament. There's some interesting stories there around the book of Revelation and Erasmus's writing, and why he at first he could only translate part of it in Greek. It's an interesting story there. We don't have time for that in this video today. I did have a little article pulled up if anyone's wondering. I was looking at my screen. I looked up one thing to double check some details before starting this. And the reason that shouldn't be something that concerns us is because Eastern Orthodox today still have an open canon. Their canon list is not closed. Is it functionally closed? Are they going to be adding any new books anytime soon? Probably not. They're not adding books. Their canon is pretty settled, but it's not officially closed. It's officially open. And they have a different view on the canon from how we in the West might tend to view it. So the church gives you the canon list. Well, the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox were in communion when Hippo and Carthage happened in the 4th century. 4th and 5th century. Late 4th into early 5th. So if they were officially binding on the entire church, they should have the exact same canon and the same understanding of the canon. But they don't. Oriental Orthodox and other various Orthodox flavors don't have the exact same canon list either. The Assyrian Church of the East doesn't. The Ethiopian Orthodox have the largest canon in all of Christendom, as far as I'm aware. I think their Old Testament, if I'm correct, is 81 books. That's a huge Old Testament. And it's not the same canon list. And if you have to have the church to give you the canon list, why from a bunch of these churches that were in the same communion do they not, and have the same understanding of how the canon's defined and approach to tradition, have different canon list? And in some cases, a different understanding of what it means to be canonical and not canonical. That's just a big pushback there, and I think it pokes a giant hole in that argument that you might hear online to try and get someone to become Roman Catholic instead of Protestant. And I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind. Now, for just some historical looks at the canon list, I'm not going to go into a super detailed, these are the exact books in each of these canon. I might do that in a later video. We just don't have time for that today. But, we didn't get this formalized 66 books as pretty much the universal, not quite, but pretty much the universal Protestant canon for a very long time. So what happened well before that? Well, in Jesus' day, and I think it's worth noting, Jesus, at least in the scriptures, gave us no canon list, so he didn't seem to think it was something we needed to be told. There was disputes on the canon of the Old Testament in his day, and he didn't define the canon for everyone in that time. But Josephus gives us pretty much this 66 book, Old Testament, not 66 book. The Old Testament you'll find in most Protestant Bibles. And notes that the Apocrypha existed, but does not count them as scripture. And notes that some did, if I'm correct. Maybe it's not Josephus who does it, maybe someone else. Then you find in the Qumran Society, the culture, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as some people might know them, some debates around exactly what their canon list was because of the exact contents of the scrolls we found there. And the Sadducees are famous for only accepting the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And what was Jesus' answer to the canon in his day? I think we see in Scripture, he argues to them from the Scriptures they accept. And we do that in our own day. Everyone argues from accepted common authorities. That's just a thing we do. But I think it's interesting to note, Jesus still expected people to know what the Scriptures were without telling them what the Scriptures were. That just seemed to be his expectation. Have you not heard? Have you not been told? Have you not read? Is it not written? However you want to phrase it. Throughout the New Testament, he says those things. Move down church history a little bit. The first formalized canon of the New Testament actually came from a heretic by the name of Marcion. Let me just move this direction. These 2 volumes right here are Justo L. Gonzalez's Church History. I recommend these, volumes 1 and 2, for an introductory church history book. And he talks about this well. but you'll find it in a lot of church history textbooks. And Marcion was a heretic who thought the God of the Old Testament was different than the God of the New Testament, Jesus, and basically ditched the Old Testament and heavily edited the New Testament. Big problem. But he was the first one to actually give a formalized canon list. And it was in response to that the church acted. Before this point, and this was in the 2nd, 3rd century, I'm not sure off the top of my head, what we had of a New Testament canon was the 4 Gospels and a handful of accepted epistles. The 7 epistles of Paul. Hebrews was accepted in a fair amount of areas, but not all, and was in circulation with Paul's epistles. I believe 1 John, and that may have been it. I'm a bit rusty on my early New Testament canon, but stuff like 2nd and 3rd John, 2nd Peter for sure, Jude, Hebrews itself were in debates about whether or not they were canonical, and some other books in early church testament, in early church history around the New Testament. But yet, no one was throwing around church authority as what should be binding people's consciences on the scriptures. They were still expected to understand when they found something that was clearly not scripture, such as the Gnostic Gospels that appeared much later, and many of the pseudepigraphal writings that were rejected. The church still functioned and kept going with different canon lists, and everyone was okay with that. Okay in the sense of allowing it to happen and not trying to tear the church apart over it. I don't know why we can't do that today. That's why I'm perfectly fine saying, yeah, each tradition, for the most part, most of us just accept the canon we have because it's the tradition passed down to us. There are people who are historians in the canon. I love church history. I'm a giant nerd about it. That is not my area of expertise and not what I enjoy reading about. But kudos to the people who do. It is an interesting topic, and I'm happy to read what they talk about it. I'm just not interested in going into all those primary sources myself on it. And then in the heat of that controversy with Marcion is when we start to get people refining the canon more and saying, all right, we can't have this happen again. We do need to have something in place, even if it's not a completely agreed upon. And that was, for the most part, the 4 Gospels, the epistles of Paul, 1 John, etc. And you'll get interesting debates, like in the East, I believe, James was often accepted and Jude was rejected. In the West, it was the other way around, or maybe I'm flipping those. But one of them accepted James over Jude more often, and in the other side, they accepted Jude over James more often. Just an interesting little note there. In Eusebius church history, we get a very well-defined canon list and a well-defined document of the books that were up for debate. He's like, these are the books that people have been debating. Some accept as scripture, some don't. Here's the ones people reject. Here's the ones everyone accepts. That's a super valuable piece of historical information. And then, of course, you get stuff like the Council of Carthage, Council of Hippo, which we've already talked about, or some people point to. And then you get a bunch of individual church fathers who give us canon lists. You get Athanasius in his Festal Letter gives pretty much a Protestant canon. I believe Cyril in his catechismal lectures gives us a canon list. Augustine and Jerome, contemporaries, have 2 different canons. Jerome translates the Apocrypha, but he doesn't accept them as canon. He knows that. But Augustine accepts some of the Apocrypha books as canon, and also notes that there's dispute around what is and isn't in the canon, even to Jerome's day and Augustine's day. Right? The debate is still going on in their day. Worth noting. Look up the dates of those councils and look up when they existed, or when Jerome and Augustine were alive. And they're having those debates. And to make a long story short, because we're already going a little longer than I wanted to, I already mentioned Luther, Erasmus, and Cardinal, very high ranking in the Roman Catholic Church, Cajetan, have this, in their time, not the most popular understanding of the canon, but a fairly common view of the canon. The disputes were still ongoing pre-Trent. And in a very real way, the Reformation is also what kind of formalized the canon list for many Protestants. I'm still on that side of being fine with an open canon list. I know that's not the most common position, especially in the West. But I don't think there's a big problem with it. If the early church functioned like that, I think we can still function like that and be just fine. But that's just a quick overview of history, and wondering, what specific books I've read on that. I can't give you a lot of specific books. I read a ton of church history. I already mentioned Eusebius and the church history is going to be one of those good primary sources to go to. History Gonzalez, I'll highly recommend. Theodoret of, can't remember, is another early church figure who wrote on church history. There's tons and tons and tons of books that go over this topic again and again and again. It is a super well-written topic. You can find tons of great articles, videos, and books going over this discussion in the various viewpoints. And some people still having the discussions today. So I recommend going and looking at all that for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Go look into these things. I will put resources in the comments. In the top comment, I'll just make a big comment and pin and put links to some good books and articles and stuff. I'll go look those up and put them in there for everyone to go check out. You guys have a wonderful day, and God bless.